Hello and welcome to another lawnfawn video. Today we are introducing the new Holly Leaves border die, as well as the new Winter Sprigs background stencil set. So let's take a closer look at both of these new products. The Holly Leaves border die cuts two holly leaves, one long border as well as one little sprig. There is also a die that will cut 10 little berries for you to decorate your holly leaves with. To add the little berries to the holly leaf border, all you need to do is add some little dots of glue to the circles that are part of the die and drop the little berries right into place. This will create a really fun and beautiful holly leaf border. Once you have all your berries in place, your holly leaf border is ready for a project. This long border will fit all the way across an A2 size card, and then you can decorate with the cute little sprig that is also included. This border has a nice little curve to it, but you can flip it to where the curve goes in the direction that you prefer. And the little sprig is great for filling in and creating more interest on the card. Now let's take a look at the Winter Sprigs background stencil set. This stencil set includes 3 stencils, so you can layer them together, creating a full background in multiple colors. Each one will fit with the one before, and each stencil has some etching lines on it so they are easy to line up with the stencil previously used. You can see those etching lines right there on that second stencil will line up with the openings of that first stencil. And the same is true for the other stencil with the pine cones. There are etching lines on it as well to help you line it up with the stencils used previously. Now each of these stencils has a number in the top right corner. This will help you align them in the correct orientation so they're not turned, and it will also tell you which order is best for inking up your stencils. Start with 1, move on to 2, and then next 3, as we're going to show you here in just a moment. So we're going to show a basic stenciling of this background. We have an A2 size card base. It is adhered to our Make Art station with a little bit of removable adhesive, and then our stencil is held in place with the magnets. We are using some Noble Fir ink to ink all the little branches and sprigs with green ink first. This is stencil number 1. We will show you how to create a card using different colors of ink in the same stencil here a little bit later in the video. So once this is all filled in with that Noble Fir ink, we'll pull the stencil away and you'll see the beautiful sprigs and holly leaves that we've created on the background. Now we can move on to our second stencil, which is the berries. We're going to make sure that that number's in the top right corner once again, and we can line up those etching lines with the sprigs and the leaves that we've already inked. This will put those little berry openings right at the ends of our little branches there. We're using some lobster ink for the berries, of course. We love those bright red berries for the holidays. And we're just adding the ink to these little berries that will be at the ends of the sprigs. There are some berries for the holly as well, and of course it's going to line up to where those berries are right near those holly leaves. So once all our berries are nice and inked, we'll pull this stencil away and then you will see how this background is starting to build. Look at those beautiful berries. Next up we have the third stencil, and we will line this up once again using those etching lines to help line it up and making sure the number 3 is in that top right corner. This is the pine cones, so of course we're going to use some dough ink for our pine cones. And this will completely fill in all those openings in the background that had yet to have any images or ink on them. And this will give us a nice full background using 3 different colors for our stencils. So now we'll pull away that stencil and we have this beautiful background filling our card, and I just love this new stencil set. Now let's make some cards using this new stencil set. First, we're recreating a card that Audrey made, so thank you so much, Audrey, for letting us remake your card today. For this card, we're actually going to use 4 different ink colors on this first stencil. So we're going in with a little finger dauber brush and some Noble Fir ink on some kraft cardstock, which had a really cool look. And we're adding that to the little pine sprigs there. So you can see with that little finger dauber, we can control where our ink is a bit more. Once we have all of the sprigs that we want to be this color colored in, we're going to switch over to artichoke ink, which is a different shade of green, and we're going to use the finger dauber to fill in the other openings on the stencil. So this is a really fun way to get even more colors into your background by just selectively inking the openings with a smaller inking tool. Now we're sticking to the sprigs with the rounded leaves using this color, and then once we have all of these filled in, so we're filling in all the ones in that same shape and style, we're going to move on to another green. This is freshly cut grass, and we're using this green to fill in the holly leaves on this. Once our holly leaves are filled in, we're going to switch over to a brown. So we're using dough ink, and this will be the final color on this stencil to fill in the little twigs where the berries are going to be. And once we're finished with that brown, we have filled in all of the openings on this stencil, and we can remove the stencil and see how our background is starting to take shape. Next, we'll pull out stencil number 2, which is the round openings for the berries on the branches and the holly leaves. Again, we'll make sure the number 2 is in the top right corner, and we'll use the etching lines on the stencil to line it up with the branches we've already inked up. For this one, we're using chili pepper red ink for our berries, and we'll get that nice dark red color on that kraft cardstock. Once we have all of these berries filled in and inked, we can remove that stencil, and you'll see again how this background is starting to take shape. Then finally, we are moving on to stencil number 3, making sure that 3 is in the top right corner and using those etching lines to line it up so that we have our pine cones filling in all the voids left on our background. For this one, we're using some walnut ink to fill in the pine cones and the other little details from this third stencil. And now that all those pine cones are filled in, we can remove this last stencil and see our beautiful background that we created. I just love the look of these ink colors on that kraft cardstock. I think it is so pretty. Next, we're going to add some white acrylic paint splatters. We're using some white Copic paint. We've added a little bit of water. We're just picking it up with our paintbrush and tapping it onto that acrylic block to add some white splatters to this background. This creates some really fun texture and gives it a really fun snowy look. Now for our sentiment, we're using the Winter Big Scripty Words hot foil plates and foiling the word Noel. We've put the hot foil plate onto the platform as it heats up. Once it is ready and that light has stopped blinking, we can add our foil with the pretty side facing towards the plate. Then we can add our cardstock and the 2 glimmer plates that come with the system. We'll pull this off the platform and run this whole thing through our die cut machine, and we'll get this beautifully foiled sentiment. Then we will use the coordinating Winter Big Scripty dies to cut out the word Noel, and that will give us a beautifully trimmed out foiled sentiment. So we'll just hold that in place with some tape and run that through our die cut machine, and you will see that we get this lovely, delicate sentiment to add to our card. Now for the background, now that our paint is dry, we can trim this out with the largest of the outside in stitch rectangles. We'll just hold that in place with some tape and run it through the die cut machine as well. And now we have a beautiful background for our card. Next, we have a piece of chili pepper cardstock cut to 4¼ by 5½, and we'll just add our stenciled background to this piece of cardstock with some foam squares. This will give us a beautiful red border around all 4 sides of our panel. Next, we're going to cut some snowflakes from white cardstock using the mini snowflakes die set. This creates some really cute little snowflakes that are perfect for decorating around your card. For our sentiment, we're using some really small micro foam squares to pop the sentiment up off the background, when this will create some really fun dimension on our card. Once our sentiment's in place here, we can start to add some of these die-cut snowflakes around, just using a little bit of liquid glue in the center to hold them in place. And this is a really fun way to add some extra elements to this card and this background. I really love these snowflakes added on top of that stenciled background. We're also going to add some sparkle by adding some sequins to the center of some of the snowflakes, just using a little dot of liquid glue in the middle and then picking up that sequin and dropping it onto that glue. And then finally, we're adding some adhesive to a card base, and we will put this whole panel onto a card base so it's ready for a sentiment inside and ready to send to a friend. I love how this card turned out. I think it is so beautiful. It is all finished now. Thank you, Audrey, so much for your inspiration and allowing us to remake your card today with this beautiful background. Now let's make a card using the holly leaves border. I've cut 2 long ones and 2 short ones from some Noble Fir Cardstock. And then for the background of my card, I'm using some favorite flannel 12 by 12. This is the hot toddy color. I will be cutting this with the largest stitch rectangle for the background of my card. But first, I need to stamp out my sentiment, and I'm using the Giant Holiday Messages stamp set, stamping that sentiment that says, "We wish you a Merry Christmas." I'm stamping this onto some speckled eggshell cardstock, and I'll be using some black ink. So I am actually going to stamp this twice with VersaFine ink to get a really nice dark black impression. I will be cutting this out with a die, but I'll be using the die from the Giant Thank You Messages die set. So this is from Giant Thank You Messages, and that is just because the die from the Giant Holiday Messages is a little bit bigger with a scallop, and I'm going to use that to layer behind. So I'm starting with the oval that has that cute little dotted detail around the outside edge. This is again from that Giant Thank You Messages die set. And I'll line it up with my sentiment that I've stamped and hold it in place with a little bit of removable tape, and then I'll run this through my die cut machine. Now for the scalloped oval that is from the Giant Holiday Messages die set, I'm going to cut this from some gold foil cardstock. And this is going to give me a really pretty oval to layer behind the oval with my sentiment. Before I layer these together, I want to add some color to the open images in this sentiment. And I'm doing this with colored pencils to kind of have that more rough, rustic look rather than markers. And I just think it's fun to add accents with colored pencils often. I'm using a light green colored pencil to add color to all those little leaves. And then I'm coming back in with a darker one just to add a little bit of shading at the base of each leaf. Nothing too fancy, just some pops of color on this sentiment. I'll also use some reds to color in the open words of we and merry. And again, I'm using 2 shades of red. I'm starting with my lighter shade at the top of the letters, coming in with my darker shade at the bottom, and then I'll go back to the lighter one to just kind of blend out that line and make it look nice and smooth. But this kind of gives the look of two-tone color to these letters. So I will do that on the word we and the word merry so that they match. And then I'm also going to go in with the red and add little red dots to those open dots. I actually end up covering this up later, but I didn't know I was going to do that. Now I can add my piece of pattern paper to my card base. And I'm ready to start to add my holly leaves. So I'm just adding some dots of glue all along the back. I did not go all the way to the end because this is a portrait card, so the end's going to hang off and I'm going to be trimming that piece off. And I wanted this to kind of curve around the oval that will be in the center. So I've got it at the top left and then kind of swooping down towards the right. And then I'll fill in this top up here with the little sprig. And I'm just tucking it behind one of the holly leaves from the long border. Again, this is hanging off the top edge, and we'll just trim off these extra pieces once we're done. Now I'm taking my second border and I'm going to make it nice and even so it's doing the same thing but on the bottom going in the opposite direction. So instead of the top left corner, I'm going to start at the bottom right corner and have it swoop up towards the left side. And I'm trying to use my grid mat to make sure it's kind of nice and even. I can see that the end of the sprig lines up with one of those grid lines, and that really helps me to get it nice and even, kind of like a flip-flopped mirror image on the bottom. Then I'll add the little sprig just as I did to the piece at the top, kind of tucking it behind that leaf. Next, I'm just going to take my scissors and trim off these pieces that are overhanging the edges and the top and the bottom as well. And we'll have this nice trimmed out holly border on the top and bottom of our card panel. Now I'm adding some foam squares to the back of my sentiment, and I'll just layer this on top of the gold foil oval so we have some dimension. And this is going to go right in the center of the card. But before I glue this to my card, I do need to add my little red berries to my holly branches. And I'll just go in and put little dots of glue on all of those little circles and start adding those berries in there. They're really easy to pick up with this little tool and drop right into place. And I really love these bright pops of red that are going to be on this card. So I am adding them to all the branches, even the ones that are going to end up being covered up by my sentiment, but I had cut the berries, so I might as well use them. And now I can add some liquid glue to the back of this oval. And then I'll just pop this right into the center there. So I'm making sure it is lined up with my grid mat so that I can really see and make sure that this is nice and straight and centered. And I love how those holly branches kind of come out from behind. They almost look like they're swirling out from behind the oval. Now I pulled out these red gems, and this is where I found that this little bitty gem here is the same size as the circles in the sentiment stamp, and I ended up adding those to those 4 little circles. So that's why I said I ended up covering them up. You could just leave them colored, but this added some shimmer. And then the large gem is actually the same size as the berries. So what I did was I just added 4 gems to 4 of the berries, on one on each branch basically. And I did make it nice and even because I've kind of have this symmetrical swirl going on, so I made sure that I did the same berry on both branches. And then here is that finished card, and I just love the way this turned out. I think it is so pretty. I love those holly branches on that background and that gold oval underneath that sentiment. Now let's make a card that uses both the winter sprigs background stencil and the holly leaves border. First, I need to start by stenciling my background, and I am using a piece of speckled eggshell cardstock, and I'm just using a grip mat. This is from the inside of my stamp wheel, and I'm using that to hold my paper in place as well as my stencil. I'm going for a lighter, more pastel-y look for this background, so I'm starting out with some celery stick ink for my greenery, and you can see that I'm also tapping it off on a scrap piece of paper to try and keep myself from being too heavy-handed with the ink. I don't want this background to be too bold. I want my images that I place on top to stand out. I'm also going in with some freshly cut grass on the same stencil and just adding a little bit of shading. So kind of some darker at the base of each of those little sprigs. You can see it's at the base of the holly leaves, at the kind of stem part of the pine boughs and the other branches. And when I pull this away, you'll see how this adds a little bit of dimension just by adding a little bit of shading to each of these elements. Now I can move on to my second stencil using those etching lines to line it up, and this will give me my berries. Now for the berries, I'm kind of going with more pink berries, so I'm using guava ink and my little blending tool to fill in those berries in a pink color. This is a bit more of non-traditional colors for this Christmas card. Finally, I can move on to my third stencil, which is the pine cones. I'll use those etching lines to line everything up, fill in those voids with those pine cones, and then for something a little different, this time instead of using brown for my pine cones, I'm actually going to use some teal colors. So I'm starting out with merman. And this is just a fun way to use a different color for these little pine cone pieces. I am going to add a little bit of shading to these as well, so I will pull out my peacock ink using that same blending brush, and I'm just tapping off so I don't get it too dark, and adding a little bit of the darker color just to the base of just the pine cones. And then I'll pull this away and you can see that background I created. Now I did stencil this in a portrait orientation, but I'm actually going to be making a landscape card with this background. I'm also going to add some shading to my holly leaves die cut, and I put it on the grip mat, which holds it perfectly to add some inking to a die cut like this. So I'm adding some jalapeno ink. This is cut from some cilantro cardstock, and that jalapeno ink will just add some shading to those holly leaves. Now I can add this to my card front, or to this panel I should say. This panel is cut with the largest outside in stitch rectangle, so when we put it on a card base, it will have a bit of a border around it. And then I'll just trim off the extra piece that's overhanging on the right side. And then I'll add my berries. To match the berries in the background, I cut these berries from Guava Cardstock. So my holly border will match the background colors that I used. Now I can add this to my pink card base, and don't do this because it's upside down. But don't worry, there's a way to fix this. I just cut it off, and then I'm going to add that whole panel to a card base again with it in the correct way, which is that the holly leaf border was at the bottom. I don't know what I was thinking when I did that. I also have some winter birds that I've already colored and cut out. I colored them in some lighter colors, that pinky color, to match the colors of the card. And I'm just adding them sitting on that holly leaf border, and then that one on the left flying up in the sky. I'm using the Seasons Tweeting Sentiment, also from the Winter Bird stamp set, and I am white heat embossing this onto a piece of raspberry cardstock. So this is slightly darker than the berries, and I'll just heat that up with my heat tool and melt that white embossing powder so I get that nice bright white sentiment. Now this piece is a little bigger than I wanted. I like to trim it out after I stamp and emboss my sentiment. I'm actually using the sentiment banner to do this. This way I can line it up with my sentiment, and I'll get the top and bottom cut nice and evenly. And then I can just trim off the left and right to get it to be the length that I want. This is just another way to do this. You could also do it with your paper trimmer. Then I've added some foam squares to the back of this sentiment, and I'm just going to pop this right into the middle. Finally, I'm adding some stickles just to the berries on the holly branch, and also just a few of those berries that are stenciled on the background. So I've just looked at my background and picked out some of those little circle dots and added some glitter to those as well for some extra shimmer and shine. And then here is that finished card. I just think it's so cute. I love those non-traditional colors, and I really think those teal pine cones are really pretty. Now let's take a look at some cards from the design team. I love Megan's card. I love the colors she used, and using Copic markers to color those holly leaf borders really gives it a really fun look. This card by Rebecca and Kelly is so much fun. I love that they decorated the holly leaf border with the ornaments and the winter birds. Kelly combined the winter sprigs background and the holly leaves borders with the poinsettia to make a beautiful holiday card. Mindy's card uses winter sprigs to create a tone-on-tone background, which is really fun with her unique color scheme. This card by Rebecca and Kelly is so sweet with those winter sprigs under vellum on the back and the holly leaves borders to decorate around the cute snow globe. And then this card by Elena is just so beautiful. I love the colors that she used and that simple Noel sentiment. Tammy used those winter sprigs for a background for her winter birds that are getting ready for the holidays in their birdhouse. And then Yainea made this really pretty card with kind of a double layered sentiment with the winter sprigs as a beautiful background as well. Marine's slimline card is so cute. I love how she used winter sprigs to create backgrounds for all the panels on this card. And then I love the look that Grace created with that single toned background and that beautiful snow globe decorated with the holly leaves branches. I love Elisa's card. This background is perfect for a big, bold sentiment like she created. And then Letitia created a background and created two different cards out of it by cutting the center out and creating a window, which is so much fun. Melissa created a really fun card using vellum to cover up that background so that her sentiment stood out perfectly. And then here's a card by Rebecca and Kelly that has a really fun foiled sentiment on that stenciled background. This is Audrey's card that inspired the card that we created today with that beautiful background on kraft. And then here's another look at the two other cards that I created today using the non-traditional colors, and then this one using the giant holiday sentiments with that beautiful holly leaves border die. Thanks so much for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.